Okay, so as all of we know, it's important to do backups before we do any upgrades. Occasionally, I get tempted to do an upgrade, and the few times that I've done it where I haven't done a backup, I have been very unhappy because inevitably something happens and you wish you'd spent that extra time. Normally, I use Evotiva DNN Backup to do my backups. It's terrific software. I'm going to talk about that in a month, but I thought it'd be interesting to look at what you have to do if for some reason you decide, I don't want to use this software, I want to do it myself. And if nothing else, going through this process helped me better appreciate the value of the Evotiva software. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through fairly quickly because there's a lot of steps about how you would do a backup. And in this case, I created a little tiny website that was called, hang on, that was called webdev.stevekarpik.com. And I wanted to do a backup of it. And a backup doesn't make any sense unless you actually verify that you can restore it. And so I want to restore it on my PC as webdev.local. So the practical problem is I've got a website on an internet host, and I'm going to take the case that's kind of more difficult in some ways, one where you're doing shared hosting. So your ability to work with the SQL server that you're hosted on is somewhat limited. And I'm going to say that I'm not going to use Evotiva Backup, and I'm going to figure out, how do I get around all of this? And so what I'm going to sort of talk about today is just sort of look at the important steps that you need to follow and the things that if you're going to make a mistake, these are the places where you're going to make the mistake and where you're going to go, why isn't this working right now? So the whole goal is to come up with something where I've got a website on the internet, I download various things, I recreate it locally, and then I feel good about being able to do an upgrade on my live site. So there's a whole bunch of components that have to get um, instantiated on your workstation. There's essentially the IIS server, the files, which you can get by FTP, the database. There's the SQL users. You have to make changes to the web config. And there's also the portal alias because you're going to give it a different URL than what it had on the internet. So the easiest part is the getting the files. Inevitably, you're going to have FTP access to your files on your server. And I like to use some software called FileZilla. It's a reliable, uh, free to use FTP client. And you have to be a little careful when it does the download that it does them all properly, because sometimes there'll be a list of files where it says, I didn't get those. And you have to make sure that you got all the files off of your server. But generally, it works really well. So we've got to get the website files. That's easy. That's just FTP. The SQL database, that's a little trickier. And then there's the IIS binding, like is it HTTP, HTTPS, et cetera, et cetera. The SQL database is where it's a little tricky because when you have shared hosting, you don't have easy full access to the SQL server. So probably you're going to have to talk to this, you're going to have to do the dump using Plesk. So first thing to do is you got to make a home for your website. So I generally have all my websites, which I have many because I like to test things. So I have a folder called websites. The name give it the name webdev.local, and then the actual files are going to go in the folder website. And then using the IIS manager, I'm going to bind the web server to that location. And you also have to make a change in the local hosts file so that when you type in webdev.local, your browser knows where to go. So as I said, with the first step is to download all of the files into that folder using FileZilla or whatever your favorite FTP client is. Got to make sure that there weren't any errors through that process. Now, the database is a little trickier. Depending on the host that you use, DNN for less, which I use for all of my um, websites, it has a Plesk interface that lets you do a dump of the database. And there's one thing that might confuse you the first time you do it. When you dump it, it comes down as a zip file. You unzip the file and you go, what is this file? Because it's got no file extension. So you have to add .bak to the file that you've just dumped off of your server. And then, at least then it makes it a little more recognizable. Um, so now, it's with the SQL Management Studio, you can you can import your the database. It's pretty easy, but then life gets a little interesting because you end up with orphaned users, and what that means is that let's say um, let's say I have a account on my SQL server on my web host, and it's, let's call it SQL user. Well, I can't just create a local account called SQL user on my PC and expect it to be able to talk to that database, because even though the usernames might be the same on that's embedded in the database and what I've just created, they have different SID values and they don't work. So what you have to do is you have to first see what's the name of the orphan. And I'm going to post all these files later. So you can find that there's certain usernames that essentially are useless, they're orphans. Um, and then and another SQL query that you can do, which basically cleans it up, gets rid of the orphans. This step is absolutely essential, or you'll never talk to the database from your DNN. So, and then connection string, that's pretty easy. You're going to have some sort of connection string that's up on your server, and then it's going to be essentially the same .SQL Express. Now, the other thing is that you have to make sure you change your portal alias on your DNN site. That baked into your DNN site is the URL that it is expecting. And so I had it before, it was webdev.stevekarpik.com. Well, if I try to visit that when I have it all installed locally, if I don't change the portal alias, DNN will say, I have no idea what you're talking about, and it doesn't give me anything useful. So you have to fix that up. Again, there's a SQL survey query that lets you see what the values are there. And then another one that lets you then change that to from webdev.stevekarpik.com to webdev.local. The last place near the last, that can sort of get you into a little bit of trouble is that on the internet, my website is HTTPS, and locally it's HTTP because I don't want to bother with SSL certs locally. And so, again, what I have to do is I want to make sure that I need to make that change, and it's going to say yes. And then there's another query that goes into the database and says, you don't need SSLs anymore. It's just HTTP. And then you recycle the IIS application pool, you go to WebDev, and lo and behold, it is going to be there. And so I guess the troubleshooting is, you know, if your SQL login doesn't work, probably got an orphan user, somehow you messed your login for SQL. If you're going to HTTPS, again, you haven't done the SSL setup right. Um, it- there's a few things, but if you follow the steps judiciously, it all works pretty good. So this process is actually one that takes quite a bit of time and care and attention. There's nothing super complicated about it, but there's lots of places to make mistakes. And that's why, in general, I don't use this process. In fact, the first time I'd used it was last night when I prepared this PowerPoint presentation. I always use the Evotiva DNN Backup because it completely hides um, all of those details. And I've been using it for years, and it's been a lifesaver at times when I've needed to rescue something from a backup. So that's a really whirlwind tour of a technique of doing backups and verifying the restores, a technique that personally I would probably never bother using because I'd rather spend this relatively small amount of money for the license for Evotiva backup. So that is it. Any questions?
As someone who's done many, many backup and restores over the years, I think you hit on all the details. I think you've hit on everything I've done wrong many, many times.
I'm going to review the PowerPoint, make sure I haven't put any mistakes in anywhere. And then I'm going to be putting this one and also the one I did, I guess, a month ago on the multilingual too sexy data. I'm going to be putting both of those on my stevekarpik.com website. So if people want to look at the details, it will be there.